conductive wire, and you were so electric. I had no say when you came so near, and just passed right through me.
Hey everyone, welcome to Geekdom is Back. I am joined once again by Richard Newby. This time we are talking all about Crisis on Infinite Earths. This was a suggestion from one of our Patreon members, and I have wanted to read this for a while now, Richard, so thank you so much for joining me and rereading this so we can talk about it. I know 80s comics can be pretty dense.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is definitely a dense one. I remember I used to refer to it as kind of the DC Comics Bible when I first read it. Wolfman and Perez are both, very, very elaborate writers. I had been reading Perez's Wonder Woman run before Wonder Woman 1984, and those took quite some time to get through. There's a lot of words. They're very prose heavy, especially compared to more contemporary comics.
Yeah, and we previously talked about Swamp Thing, which has the same sort of thing going for it. I don't want to call it a problem because this is definitely what comics were at the time, and even though it takes me a lot longer to read through them, especially this one, because a lot of the issues were 24, 25 pages, but then you had some that were over 40 pages, and with how many words they put in, it's a lot. And I have been getting into comics more and more, and because I didn't get into comics until, I want to say, sometime in the 2010s, everything wasn't as wordy by then. So my knowledge of comics mostly comes from a lot of visuals, just telling you the story without needing the words. And in these comics, especially in Crisis on Infinite Earths, if I didn't have some of these things that were like, these are these characters, I would have been even more lost than I was at times.
Yeah, there are so many characters in this. It's a really great introduction, to if you are interested in kind of diving into a certain character. It's kind of great to be like, oh, who's this? I want to find out more about them. But it can be a little overwhelming at times, for sure.
Yeah, and because of the fact that you have so many characters, and then you have duplicates of characters too in this, which we will definitely touch on soon, but it was just overload at times. And again, I'm not criticizing it for that because I know this was a massive, massive event. And in order to have an event of this caliber, you need to have that many characters. And out of curiosity, do you watch the CW shows?
I used to. I fell behind. I couldn't keep up with all of them, so I missed their Crisis one. I saw photos from it, but yeah, I'm so far behind that I haven't had time to catch up.
Yeah, so I had watched that before having read this comic, and because I had seen that, I was like, okay, they're gonna get 10 roughly heroes together, and in this, you're like, oh, that's not the number at all.
Yeah, it's thousands of characters and so many different worlds. It's such an ambitious project.
Yeah, and Marv Wolfman has been in comics for such a long time. I went to WonderCon in Anaheim, and he was speaking and talking about writing stories and things like that. And even though I don't write comics or anything, again, I'm always interested in how these things are made that I'm consuming and that other people are creating. So I went and took some notes, and I was like, yeah, this is why people really love his stories, because a lot of people love his Teen Titans run as well.
Yeah, his Teen Titans run is legendary. It's one of the best. He's so good at crafting characters and making each one of them distinct and unique, which is a real skill. You read Wolfman's stuff and you're never thinking, oh, well, anyone could be substituted for this character. There's a real craft in how he builds relationships.
Yeah, and because of how much is going on in this story. Even though it doesn't feel like 12 issues is a lot of time to craft those kinds of relationships, he still manages to do it. So when we get to a point later in the series, you're really understanding a lot of the characters' emotions that they're feeling. And, why don't we go ahead and start at the top, though? Because I think there are at least 2 or 3 things to point out from each issue. And with issue 1, it kind of begins with the demise of Earth 3, and you're really seeing the consequences right away.
Yeah, it starts off with a bang. You're introduced to so many characters, and the character Pariah, who I think is a really cool, interesting figure, who's not a major DC character, afterwards. So already, from the get-go, it's building this really interesting mythology and lore.
There were a lot of characters I admittedly didn't recognize, and I was like, am I a bad comic book fan, or are they just pulling characters that you wouldn't naturally think of with a story like this?
Yeah, a lot of them are just characters that you wouldn't think of, unless you were reading, every DC comic published before this point. Which I feel like most people haven't.
Right.
When I read this, I had read comics for a long time. I think I read this for the first time in high school. But even then, even having, read comics since I was, around 5 or 6, there are so many characters that I was unfamiliar with. And I think it really just showcases how expansive the DC universe is, because just as you said, in the opening issues, there's so many characters, and it's really just mind blowing. Not only these alternate Earth characters, but then you've got Orion and Commandy, and a bunch of these Silver Age characters that a lot of them had kind of fallen to the wayside, but then here they're being brought back. There's just such a consideration for continuity in this that I think is one of the things that makes it stand out so much.
I love when characters you wouldn't naturally think of are used in this kind of context too, because it really puts a spotlight on just how capable some of these characters are. And even though they aren't the first characters who come to mind when you think of this mega crisis, you're kind of like, oh, these characters are a lot more powerful than we thought.
Yeah, definitely. There's a lot of different power sets going on in here. And it's kind of crazy the fact that Wolfman can showcase how powerful they are, but at the same time, come up with a compelling threat, so that, it's not, as a reader, you're not immediately well, I feel with all these characters with these massive powers, they should be able to, easily get through this situation. But so he builds up all these powers, and then he's well, there's an even bigger power, in terms of the Anti-Monitor and this whole crisis. So he really kind of creates a scale, I think, in terms of superhero abilities.
Yeah, and in the first issue, we also see Lila becoming Harbinger.
Yeah.
And I think that just kind of kicks you off very nicely. And even though I didn't recognize a lot of the characters who popped up in the first issue, you get to know enough about them throughout this. And obviously, if you wanted to really get the full scope of the story, there are so many other tie-in issues, and I want to make it clear here that we just read the core series, those 12 issues, because otherwise we would have been reading 50 issues for this episode.
Yeah, there's so many tie-in issues. I to this day have not read all of the tie-in issues, so I can't even imagine how many other little connective things are going on in this event. But I do think that the core series does a really good job of making it so that you can just read these 12 issues and still get the full story. Which I think that, it's kind of interesting to just kind of touch on modern comics a little bit. Events are kind of they're the big moneymaker, at DC and Marvel, but they're also kind of subject to the most criticism because they come out so frequently and because there's so many tie-in issues. And a lot of times those tie-in issues contain like really pertinent information that if you don't read them, then you kind of don't really get the scope of what's going on in the main series. But here, I feel like this is kind of like I guess this would kind of be like the blueprint of what I would suggest of like how to do a really great event series that, is connecting to, all the ongoings at the time, but is also really self-contained and you can just enjoy these 12 issues and still feel like you got the full story.
Yeah, and aside from the relatively dense dialogue and narration that happens in this, I think this is a story that holds up pretty well because you have so many characters, and granted, DC and Marvel have both done a better job of having more diverse characters that obviously some might not have existed in the 80s to have been in this, but you have characters like Cyborg showing up, and it's always nice to see that those characters aren't being left out of these major events.
Yeah, and I think that is, that's another thing that I feel like a lot of times, with modern comics, we get all of these really cool characters that are introduced and then we kind of like never hear from them again or they're forgotten about. And I feel like Wolfman just like is really comprehensive. Like he's bringing in everybody, like no matter how big or small. And then the cool thing is that, some of the smaller characters or what you would say are like the B or C list characters, they get like really cool like action moments and also just like emotional moments. And that's something that I really appreciate because I think that, a lot of times with the modern events, in terms of the DC side of things, you have Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman, and of course everybody wants to see them, but like they kind of like take up all the breathing room and some of the side or lesser known characters don't get as much to do. But yeah, I feel like here, everybody kind of gets some of the spotlight, which I think is really cool. Like Firestorm, for example. Like when I read this, I was not, super familiar with Firestorm, but like he gets so many cool moments in this that this is like the book that made me a fan of the character.
Yeah, I had been familiar with the character from watching the CW shows, and because they did the event in a very similar way, it allows you to have an understanding of these characters that you maybe normally wouldn't pay attention to, because I'm sure there are a lot of people out there, especially at this time, who really only cared about Superman stories or wanted more Wonder Woman. They have their big three in those two and Batman, but I love that Batman actually kind of takes a back seat. We see him in issue 2, and he has this thing going on with the Joker because, of course, Joker has to get his little appearances in here, but they're not overwhelming in a way that I think sometimes creators will do when Batman and Joker appear in a story. Instead, they are used more sparingly, Joker more so than Batman, but they're interrupted by the Flash, and this is when we really see that something big is happening and the heroes know about it.
Yeah. That's a really cool moment too. And it really starts this like interesting relationship between Flash and Batman that's kind of continued on to this day in terms of them kind of like being some of the earliest characters to like be aware that like something major is going on in the universe. And especially like, since they're both detective characters, very different, tones and characterizations, but it's kind of a cool partnership that I think got really, developed starting with this.
Yeah, and in issue 2, we see who has been summoned by Harbinger, and it's Psycho Pirate, Firebrand, Simon, Blue Beetle, Solivar, Geoforce, Firestorm, Killer Frost, Superman, Orion, Dr. Polaris, Obsidian, Cyborg, Dawnstar, and Green Lantern, which is Stewart's Green Lantern, not Hal. And I think that was one of the things that struck me, because I was looking at those characters and I was like, okay, Superman and Green Lantern are really the only two massive names out of this group.
Yeah. But yeah, like the other ones, like the smaller characters, they're made like so cool. Like Psycho Pirate, I think is such a cool character in the series. And that's another one that I was not familiar with until I read this book. But yeah, I really like that. You know, it's not just a selection, a Harbinger selecting like all the A-listers. You know, it's a lot of more obscure characters. And even, you know, like Solivar, like, I mean, that's really cool too. I mean, I feel like most, you know, fans of comics are familiar with Gorilla Grodd, but not some of the other, you know, gorillas from Gorilla City. So I think that, you know, those choices of those characters are just really cool. And it just like shows how much Wolfman just kind of loves this entire universe, and not just, you know, the big characters. Yeah, it's still really impressive to this day of just how they picked, you know, who to use and who to bring together for this.
And it's kind of crazy some of the pairings you have on the other Earths. Like on Earth 3, you have Lex and Lois. They're married and they have a son. And you're just like, hold on. I kind of want an explanation for this.
Yeah, like all of that stuff is just like so cool. And I feel like that's kind of one of the wonders of the multiverse. Is that you get to see all these different interpretations of these characters, and kind of like, you know, kind of like what Marvel does with their what if books, but it's kind of like, you know, other than just being like a one-off alternate story, like this is a whole world of what ifs, you know, and all these, you know, different storylines that, you know, people have actually, you know, these characters have actually like lived in for a while and built lives in. And you get a sense of that too. You know, that's one of the things that I feel like is so impactful about the tragedy of the worlds being destroyed, is that, you know, even the ones that you only see for a brief period of time, like you really get a sense of the history of these places, but then also like the relationships built. So you like immediately, you know, kind of grieve for these worlds and for these characters that get destroyed.
Yeah, because even though we don't know the full stories, we still get enough of a glimpse at these lives to be like, man, they really just did that, didn't they? It's almost like when they blow up Alderaan in Star Wars.
Yeah, that's a good comparison. Yeah, it's just all of these lives just like kind of like snuffed out, and you're kind of just like left with the weight of that.
You also get the first look at the consequences of time in issue 3, because we're taken back to like the Jonah Hex days, you know?
Yeah, that's cool too. Like the whole history aspect of it. And you see, I think it's the Rawhide Kid, some of these other like really obscure like Western characters from DC, and like that's really cool too, because it's just like, you know, it's giving a sense that like DC is more than just, you know, superheroes, and it's more than just like the modern age. You know, it's all of these like cool little interesting, you know, corners that you wouldn't necessarily expect.
What I love too is that they keep the big villain in the shadow, literally, for quite a few issues, because when issue 4 rolls around, we see that Psycho Pirate is working with the enemy. We also get that with Harbinger, and those two, you know, that happens in issue 3, but in issue 4, Red Tornado is basically just sucked in by the enemy, and you're just like, who is this? And I love that they keep that mystery going, and they aren't just like right off the bat, oh, it's this character.
Yeah, they really like make him a looming presence, like especially for, you know, a new villain. You know, that's the other interesting thing. You know, even though you get like some familiar faces that team up with him, like Brainiac, like Anti-Monitor is just like it's new for everybody who's reading this for the first time.
Yeah.
And so like he's immediately like made a big deal. And kind of going back to your Star Wars reference earlier, it's kind of like, in A New Hope where Darth Vader like enters the bridge and like immediately that like this is the baddest dude. And that's kind of like the sense that you get with Anti-Monitor, kind of looming in the shadows, and then his full reveal. Like there's just like an anticipation of like who could be, this disruptive to the entire DC multiverse.
Yeah, and you have levity throughout this too, because in this issue, Psycho Pirate has made Killer Frost fall in love with Firestorm, basically.
Yeah.
And it adds just that little element of comedy that we've come to expect from superhero comics in particular. And I just like that you don't lose that in this big, scary event for these characters.
Yeah, there's definitely a sense of fun and levity that happens, like despite all of the tragedies. And that's another thing that I think that Marv Wolfman really excels at, and I think really developed when he did the Teen Titans, is that there's a lot of heartbreaking stuff and betrayals and deaths, but like there's still something that's so enticing to it. In some ways, like I feel like Wolfman has this like comforting voice as a writer where you feel, even though these terrible things are happening, you feel like you're in like safe hands in terms of a writer who like really cares about these characters and who is like gonna take you through all of the emotions, but not just kind of like constantly torment you with the darkness of it all.
Yeah, and we don't have to go through every single issue and every single detail here because there's so much going on because of how many characters there are that we'll spend, a page, half a page even sometimes with characters in one area, and then we're moving on to the next area. And it's not that the story jumps around a lot, but it's just that there are so many angles to cover with a crisis like this. And I think they do the best that they can given the kind of story it is, because this is one of those stories where 12 issues is definitely a lot for a single event, but at the same time, you almost wish they would have given it to you in smaller chunks that were maybe spread out a little more and didn't have a bunch of tie-ins, because I do notice when I'm reading through these that, there's the little asterisk and they're like, go see this issue. And I'm like, I'm not going to do that. So it would have been nice to maybe just have little recaps, like 1 or 2 panels of what this is referencing, and then kind of giving us more of what's going on in the crisis, because like you said, you haven't even read through all of the tie-ins and you have read this at least twice, right?
Yeah. One of the things that I relied on really heavily the first time I read this was the DC encyclopedia.
Okay.
And so that definitely helped me navigate. I think that I want to say that when this was released, that so DC used to release these Who's Who books, and they were basically the same idea, these encyclopedias where they'd give the stats and bios of all the characters at the time. And I want to say that they released one alongside Crisis or shortly before Crisis. So I think people might have had that going for them, as they were reading it then. But yeah, I definitely think that it's a work that, whether you have like a physical DC encyclopedia or you're just kind of like leaning on Wikipedia, I think it's definitely kind of helpful to get some of the background for some of the characters as you read it.
I have been collecting reference books recently, but by and large, they have been Star Wars books. So I haven't bought any of the Marvel or DC encyclopedias, really. I do have some of like the art of the movie books from Marvel and Pixar and stuff. But yeah, I think I really need to get like 1 or 2 reference books for both Marvel and DC to help me sort of prepare a little better for these episodes and just keep things straight in my head as well, because sometimes you read through a comic and if you're in a hurry, you'll miss some things, but I did try to really take my time with this because I knew how much was going to be in it. And, you get about halfway through and then you have all of the heroes traveling to the various Earths to save them. And you see them in smaller groups in this instance, which I think helps. And I will never not find it funny that Uncle Sam is a character in DC Comics.
It is quite hilarious. Yeah, it's a really weird, interesting choice. Like there's a lot of just like weird characters that I feel like don't get used in DC anymore that I kind of wish that they would like bring back. Just like some of the like, it's so comic booky and goofy to just have like an Uncle Sam character. But yeah, I do wish that they would kind of utilize some of these characters more, because I do think that it makes the whole universe more interesting.
Yeah, and then we see the return of Lila at the end of issue 6, and after her transformation in issue 1, you're kind of like, okay, why is this happening? And it adds to that unknown element, because we're like, okay, is she Lila for the rest of the story now, or what's going on? And I think they do a good job of keeping you guessing, because even when it feels like this story is over, especially after the first 6 or 7 issues, you really feel like, oh, okay, they've figured out how to save the Earths. Everything is going to be fine. But then if you are reading this after it's been collected, like I was, you know that you still have half of the story left and this can't be over.
Yeah. That's a really interesting point too. I think that there's a lot to be said in terms of reading a series issue by issue, and they're coming out on a monthly basis versus reading it, as an entire collection. And especially like something as ambitious as this with all of these characters. Like, to be honest, I can't imagine reading this like with month-long gaps in between the issue for like a year or so.
Here's my thing about reading monthly series monthly. I will never remember what happened a month later.
Yeah, it's pretty difficult. Like I even struggle with that. I've been reading comics forever, and yeah, I prefer to read the collected volumes because I always end up forgetting, especially if I'm reading like multiple series at the same time.
Yeah, because you figure a lot of comic book fans, whether they just love DC or love Marvel, or if you like both things and Image Comics on top of that, you can easily be reading 10 different comic book series a month. And I don't know how I would keep that straight. And maybe it's just because, I'm working on these podcasts, so I'm reading a bunch of comics and books and everything all the time, that my ability to retain details is not super fantastic because of the pace that I'm reading things at. And I do like to try to spend more time with things, and I think subscribing to things like Marvel Unlimited and now DC Universe Infinite have helped with that, because I can get the full story at once, and I think reading it in a few days versus, like you said, over the span of a year is going to help me retain more of that story, just because I'm getting it all within a few days or a week.
Yeah, definitely. I recently signed up for the Unlimited as well, and DC Universe Infinite. I typically read things as physical copies, but I just started getting into digital, and it definitely helps to kind of have like all of that at your fingertips, to be able to read like not only just like the whole volume of one story, but then also the next volume as well. It really helps, to keep track of continuity in that way.
As someone who has 5 bookshelves in the room I am sitting in right now, I understand loving physical media, but I am absolutely out of room. I actually had a book come in the mail today, and I was like, oh no, where am I going to put this? And granted, of the 5 bookshelves, only 2 shelves And by 2 shelves, I mean on a single bookshelf, only 2 shelves are comics because, Stephen King takes up pretty much an entire bookshelf by himself. But you can fit a lot of comics on 2 shelves of one bookshelf. And for me, Marvel Unlimited and DC Universe Infinite, which the latter is how I read this, it's just so convenient. And obviously, this isn't the point of this episode, but for me to read Crisis and be able to just kind of swipe through if I needed to, like when I read off the character names from issue 2, I just quickly went and found it and they were there and it was nice and easy. And you can see all of the pages at once if you go to a certain view and just scroll through them instead of, I imagine flipping through the pages isn't that much more difficult, but when you can see a bunch of pages at a glance, you're like, okay, there's the thing I need. And it's a very nice reading experience, especially if you are reviewing it for a podcast like this. And, to dive into the second half, issue 7 kicks off with the story of how the Anti-Monitor was set free, and we're given some more context as to why this event is happening. And I love that they waited until the second half of the story to give us that.
Yeah, it's a cool choice. It definitely builds some anticipation and some mystery in that sense.
Yeah, plus you have a new character taking over as Dr. Light, and we see her story, and she is really starting to come around in this issue because she sees the sacrifice that Supergirl is willing to make. And in this series, you have that super iconic cover of Superman just carrying Supergirl's dead body.
Yeah.
And it's just so powerful. And I think the covers for this series are really good because you have ones like that are just so powerful. And then you have ones that show you just how hectic everything is because there's so many heroes on the cover and a lot's going on. And, I don't typically pay too much attention to covers, but that one was one that caught my eye. I was like, oh boy, here we go.
Yeah, it's one of the most iconic comic book covers. Like, so many artists have referenced that, and like across companies, Marvel has done their own homages to that, and Dark Horse and Image. It's just like such a powerful cover.
Yeah, and there was actually something I was a little confused on, so I wanted to ask you about it. It happens in issue 8, and this is when the Flash gets his energy back, takes down Psycho Pirate, and you have the explosion of Red Tornado, but then you have Flash destroying the cannon, and is he the one who becomes the Spectre, or does the Spectre just happen to appear?
The Spectre appears.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I know that in the CW show, something similar happened, but it didn't involve the Flash, and I made a mistake in my notes thinking that the Flash was suddenly the Spectre, and I was like, I don't think that's right, so I think my brain did something wrong here, so thank you for clarifying that for me.
Yeah. This is the original Spectre, but like eventually, like later on, like much further down the line in DC Comics, Hal Jordan dies and becomes the Spectre. So there is like a history of DC Comics characters becoming the Spectre, but that one is the original guy, Jim Corrigan. So he's always been the Spectre since his origin story.
I think it was just the timing that tricked me because it was like this explosion and Flash destroying the cannon, and then all of a sudden the Spectre's here, and you're like, wait, what are they doing here?
Yeah.
But yeah, are there any moments from, like issues 9 through 11 that you want to point out in particular? I know we're not getting super into the weeds here. I think if we wanted to do that, we would have to go like issue by issue for each episode and do like 12 episodes on this.
Yeah. For one, I love the supervillain team up.
Yes.
I think is that 9.
Yeah.
Yeah. I love all those bad, and that has a great cover too, but yeah, I love all the villains kind of coming together and forming their own league with Luthor, at the forefront.
Shocking.
Yeah. And then I love the moment with I believe it's Superman from Earth 2, the older Superman. Yeah, I think that like, he's a really cool character. I think his moments with the older Lois are really great too, and his sacrifice. Like I think that that's kind of just like such a cool Superman moment.
I think him and Wally show the most emotion in these last few issues, and it really just gives more power to the story.
Yeah, and I don't know if you've read the sequel, Infinite Crisis.
It's sitting on my shelf. I have not read it yet.
Okay, but that is really awesome too. So yeah, if you enjoyed this, you'll definitely enjoy that, and that has some really cool callbacks to this as well. Yeah.
I'll have to read that soon then, so that I don't forget as much of this as possible.
Yeah, definitely read it soon. It's really good. It ties in really nicely.
Yeah, and I love when they get the heroes together in issue 11 and they all meet at Titan's Tower, and it's just sort of a nice thing for Marv to do, because you're like, okay, we get it. We get what you're doing, but we also still love it.
Yeah. Yeah, and then the other thing that I really like, the epilogue, I love that Psycho Pirate is like the only one who remembers everything that happened.
Yeah, let's dive into the final issue a bit, because this one was over 40 pages, so a lot happens, and you have the shadow demons appearing, and you have Brainiac taking the quote-unquote Earthmen to Apocalypse, and there's so many moving pieces in this final issue that you still aren't even really sure if it's going to come together and work in the end.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff in that ending that happens. There's a lot of pieces that need to come together, and I love how Darkseid is like also, he has a stake in it too. Joining the heroes to defeat the Anti-Monitor. Like I love stuff like that where, not only is it bringing together all these heroes from across multiverses, but it's bringing the villains together too. And so I love that moment between Alexander Luthor and Darkseid.
Yeah, and I think what makes this story come together in the end is the fact that there are a lot of characters who die or end up being erased during this crisis. It's not like the heroes won and everything went back to normal. This was very much a story that had massive consequences, and you also have different plays on some of the characters. Like Huntress was Helena Wayne, you know, and I like that they kind of do that with the different Earths, and they give you these different characters, and you have Earth 3 Lois, Earth 1 Supergirl, Steve Trevor, who, two of him die. So you also have 2 Wonder Woman, and you have, I'll admit this, it was very weird to keep reading the name Captain Marvel, because this was before I think they had to stop using that name. And I was like, wait, hold on. My brain, it's having some trouble.
Yeah, that's definitely a weird one.
Yeah, so the fact that you have characters who just exist without existing too, I think is a really powerful statement.
Yeah, definitely. And it's interesting too, because so much of what followed in DC Universe, I mean, not only in terms of just like streamlining continuity and, rebooting everything, I think DC has still been going back and forth on, whether they benefit from having a multiverse or not. And so it's kind of interesting that, this was done to clear up continuity. I mean, that was the basis of the story, just to streamline it and to make sense of the fact that, well, you had Batman in the 40s, or he carried a gun and he killed his enemies, and you had the super, goofy Batman of the 50s and 60s, and then you start to get to the dark one of the 70s. And so, getting rid of all of that and just like starting from scratch with Frank Miller's Year One, and then, John Byrne's Man of Steel and George Perez's Wonder Woman, and so all of that was just like really interesting. But then, you kind of see DC over a time being like, well, maybe the multiverse concept is something that we need. How can we bring it back? But how can we bring it back in a way that makes sense? And even to this very month, I mean, DC has kind of rebooted itself again with another one of these like kind of crisis events, and kind of like opened up the doors to what they're calling the Omniverse. And so it's just like really interesting of how what Mark Wolfman and George Perez did here, in '86 is still having major ramifications for everything that DC has published since.
Yeah, and it's always hard to go back and read through everything that companies like Marvel and DC have put out. And even if you don't necessarily care for a specific time period of comics, I think there are ones that are really important to read. And this is definitely one from the 80s that I think all DC fans should check out. But Richard, before we dive into some other recommendations here, I know you've mentioned a few things already. Is there anything else you want to say about Crisis on Infinite Earths? I really enjoyed this.
Yeah, I also it's a favorite of mine. I just feel like not only is it a great story, but it's such a good introduction to so many characters that you might not be familiar with DC. And so for me, I always try to think about comics being an invitation. I think that, sometimes people can get overwhelmed by like the sheer volume of comics that exist. But I feel like, even though this is such a major story and it's 12 issues and there's so many characters, I really do think that it works as an invitation, to not only read this, but to explore, other characters and characters who you might not be familiar with, outside of the Batman and Superman and Wonder Woman's. So yeah, I think that, if you're interested in DC, this is definitely a must read.
Yeah, absolutely. And my recommendation, I think, falls under that same category of a must read. And I'm going to recommend that if you enjoy Crisis, check out Kingdom Come if you haven't. I know that has a huge Superman presence, but it still has a lot of characters. And I think the story is contained enough to where if, like with Crisis, you don't read all of the tie-in issues, you'll still get the full story.
Yeah, Kingdom Come is a great one. I'm a big fan of that one as well. And I would also recommend Infinite Crisis, which I mentioned earlier, which is the sequel to this, but I believe it came out in 2004. So there's a big time period. But it deals with, some of the ramifications of this, some of the characters of this, pop back up in some unexpected ways. And then that was followed by DC's weekly series called 52.
Okay.
And that is kind of like the rebuilding of the multiverse. But that's great. It's co-written by Grant Morrison, Greg Rucka, a lot of great writers on that. It's 52 issues, which seems daunting, but it's broken up. I believe there's 3 volumes of it, but it reads really smoothly. But yeah, Infinite Crisis and 52 really pick up the threads of this, and do the same kind of thing where you get a bunch of characters to explore and a lot of cool multiverse stuff, and especially with DC building their own multiverse in the film and television side of things. I definitely think that a lot of fans interested in that kind of stuff will find a lot to enjoy in those stories.
Yeah, and I also like to do ratings real quick before we wrap up, and I would give this a 4 out of 5.
Yeah.
I know for a lot of people that the 80s is like their era, and I think if I had read a modern day version of this, maybe it would be a 5 out of 5 for me, but it is a lot of work to get through this, and I think that's kind of what puts it at a 4 instead. And it's a lot to keep track of. It's almost like you need a character list at the beginning of each issue.
Yeah, I think a 4 out of 5 is what I give it to. Yeah, I think just having, like come up with modern comics, I do think that it is a bit of a switch to kind of go back and read some of these older issues. It's very much worth it, but it's definitely more time consuming, and the style is very different. There's a lot of telling. I mean, the art is brilliant, but there's a lot of prose that goes with it as well.
Absolutely. Well, Richard, thank you for joining me today to talk about Crisis on Infinite Earths. It's been a blast. I definitely have my work cut out for me with checking out your recommendations.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was really fun.
All right, everyone, that does it for this episode of Welcome to Geekdom. If you want to support the podcast, you can do so through our Patreon. If you want to follow us on socials, you can do so at GeekdomPod on Twitter and at Welcome to Geekdom on Instagram and Facebook. And as always, thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.